Why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm just going to make a few announcements tonight, and I'm just pulling up my notes here. I'd like to welcome everyone. I know we still have folks joining us, but welcome everyone who's on so far to this event hosted by the Columbia University Department of Medicine and the Columbia Center for Clinical Medical Ethics. My name is Lydia Dugdale. I'm the director of the center, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here for our first event for the 2020-2021 academic year. We have hosted typically an evening seminar series every 3 to 4 weeks. We used to do them over dinner, but in the present moment, we gather virtually. So we're delighted because that means we can have so many folks from around the country and actually some other countries join us. But we did love dining in person. So we missed that, and we look forward to getting back to that in due course. If you reached us tonight through some other means than our normal listserv, please, if you are interested in joining our listserv, send us an email at ethics@cumc.columbia.edu, and we would be happy to add you to our listserv. As you saw from the announcement, tonight's event is titled Biomedical Ethics and the Existential Threat to Persons with Disabilities. And we are delighted to welcome Professor Rosemarie Garland-Thomson. And I can't think of anyone that is better equipped on so many levels to kick off our season and to start with a talk on disability and ethics. Professor Garland-Thomson is a disability justice and culture thought leader. She's a bioethicist, she's a teacher, she's a brilliant writer, a humanities scholar. She wrote an op-ed in 2016 titled Becoming Disabled that was in the New York Times, and that set off a flurry of work on disability by people living with disabilities. And that has just sort of exploded in terms of this field. Professor Rosemarie Thomson is a professor of English and bioethics at Emory, though emeritus, almost heading in that direction. And she has been teaching disability studies and bioethics, as well as American literature and culture at Emory, along with feminist theory. Her work develops the field of critical disability studies and the health humanities to bring forward disability, culture, access, and justice to a broad range of institutions and communities. She has been chief project advisor to something called the Art of Flourishing, Conversations on Disability and Technology through the Hastings Center, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's written prolifically, co-edited a book entitled About Us, which is a collection of essays from the New York Times series on folks living with disabilities. So that I commend to you. And then she's also the author of Staring, How We Look, as well as other books. So I'm just so grateful to have you here tonight, Rosemarie. The way the evening's going to go, we'll have about 30 minutes to hear from her. And after her formal remarks, we'll take Q&A. I would invite the audience to send questions through the chat function directly to me. If we're using a new platform tonight, so if you think we look like we don't know what we're doing, we are learning. So if you can't send them directly to me, Lydia Dugdale, please send them to the panelists, and what I will do is sort of work through them and then give them to Rosemarie during the Q&A session. We plan to end promptly at 7:30, so we'll wrap up at that point. Without any further ado, Rosemarie, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, and we will turn it over to her. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Lydia, for that generous introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to present this rather formal lecture in this new format, which will be certainly a challenge. Maybe it already is. There we go. Okay. I also want to be sure to thank Charlene Sahi for her excellent administrative expertise in all of this. And I really want to thank the audience for joining in tonight, and the future audience for this, for your participation, and also for your patience in this new world of digital professional connections. So as I suggested, I'm going to present this piece rather formally with helpful pull-out phrases because without being in person together, I think we might have some compromises. So this is an experiment. Thank you for being with me. So my talk this evening is titled, perhaps somewhat pretentiously, Biomedical Ethics and the Existential Threat to Persons with Disabilities. The talk tonight is going to have 3 sections, and I want to summarize those 3 sections here in hopes of making this, again, new disembodied form of speaking a little bit more effective. So first, I'll begin by offering, next, the story of my friend and his disabled son. And it's a kind of narrative case study. This story shows us, next, the paradoxical relationship between our then self and our now self. In other words, the story invites us to consider the difference between the person we were at one point in our lives and the person who we are now. This concept of selves placed in different points in the history of our human lives helps us understand, next, the limits of what we can know and understand, what philosophers would call the epistemological and the phenomenological constraints that our biological, fleshly bodies impose on us. This concept of human limitation is what some ethicists call the situation of human finitude. In the second part of my talk, I'll reflect on my friend's particular story about his disabled son in order to consider how we might effectively and how we might live effectively with the distinctively modern, next, existential burden of needing to make decisions in the present that will yield intended but uncertain future outcomes. To do this, I'll lay out the existential situation facing modern people, and I'll consider, next, the fragility of our individual and collective future-making endeavors. Then I'll describe how this existential situation has given rise to a worldview, an ideology, if you will, that we call eugenic science or eugenic medicine. And I'll define this kind of eugenic practice as a way of understanding human variation, next, that harms individuals and the common good by reducing human diversity and violating the principle of human equality that modern liberal societies depend on as a principle of justice. Third, I'll explain, next. How about if I just raise my finger, Charlene, and we'll go to next that way. I'll explain, third, the benefits of human variation for individuals and communities. Great. And I'll call for an attitude of humility, restraint, and stewardship to guide the development and the implementation of medical technologies that aim to control future outcomes through present actions. Let me begin with my friend's story. If there had been a test for autism, my friend tells me, when my wife was pregnant with our son, she definitely would have had an abortion. He tells me this with candor because he knows that I know that this does not mean that he regrets having the son that they have, grown up now as he is. Parents with disabled children are usually rightfully wary to engage in these kinds of conversations, but perhaps because I have a significant congenital genetic disability myself, we, my friend and I, can talk together with intimacy and mutual understanding. With this reflection about what we now consider his reproductive choice, my friend is reaching back from the person he is today, his now self, toward the person that he was before his son was born, what philosophers, I've suggested, call his then self. This act of self-consciousness, this reflective human habit of reimagining then through the knowledge of now, causes a catch in my friend's throat. What if, I press on, you had not had this particular son you have now, but instead perhaps another child different from him, or perhaps no child at all? He pauses, trying to imagine his life without that particular boy, or with another one in his place. He gently touches my arm, and he pauses, and he slightly grimaces under the task of conjuring a response to what I have demanded from him. He goes on, I would not be able to be who I am now, he tells me thoughtfully, without my even having to ask. He continues by saying that how parenting a child with a significant disability like his son's transformed his own life and made his family what it is. My friend explains that having the exact boy with the characteristics that we think of as autism shaped not just the person he has become, but also his relationships with everyone in his family, his understanding of the world, and the meaning of life itself for him. His life, as he understands it in the moment of our conversation, benefited from having that boy and would have been diminished without him. The catch in my friend's throat during our conversation witnesses the burden of knowledge, the fragility of our future-making endeavors, the ideas that he would have selected against bringing that son into his life then, and the life he would have had without his son now, are unimaginable to him. So how do we account for this contradiction between my friend's then self and his now self, between what he knew then and what he knows now? More important, how can we honor this paradox inherent in the arc of human intentionality? This break with the way that human knowledge informs our actions across time and space, a break that causes my friend to suffer. What is counterintuitive, of course, to many of us is that my friend suffers not because he has a son who has some of the characteristics we think of as autism, but rather because he knows that he might have acted then based on medical information that would have caused him now not to have that beloved son. In other words, what my friend then considered his best interests are in fact the opposite of what he now recognizes are his very best interests. Two, the existential burden of freedom. European philosophers and the writers of the early to mid 20th century gave us some useful ways to think about a situation such as my friend's. Intellectuals and writers such as Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Albert Camus dramatized the paradox of what they took to be this distinctively modern condition of freedom. They described our modern situation as a tragic mode of being in which what they called man stood at the edge of an abyss from which secularization had withdrawn the hand of God. They sought for a way for human beings to find at least meaning and at most nobility in a world liberated from divine control and delivered over to the self-government that characterizes our modern era. Forced now to choose how to take the first step with no divine guidance or foreknowledge of the consequences, modern people nonetheless had a moral imperative to live out with integrity the life that this terrible freedom yielded. These modern thinkers knew that this new form of freedom was more a curse than a benefit because the outcomes of our choices are contingent, unpredictable, and outside our control. For them, the tragic dimension of modern personhood was that the link between action and outcome could never be made to be secure. In the decades before these European writers contemplated the new world of freedom and self-determination, medical science had developed eugenics, the dominant scientific theory of the early to mid-20th century. Eugenics harnessed the modern spirit of progress and improvement that was secured by the truth value of scientific rather than divine authority. Eugenics promised to make us a better future and a better citizenry by producing the supposed best kind of people. Eugenic medicine assured evolution, not devolution, of the body politic through achieving sameness and containing human diversity by identifying human variations that counted as disease through diagnosis and treatment and prognosis. Controlling future outcomes through present action at the biological level is a form of human rationalization, then, that the philosopher Ian Hacking has called making up people, and I'm quoting Hacking here. With the science of eugenics, modern medicine went beyond the traditional aim of ameliorating human suffering and the immediate effects of mortality. Although certainly modern medicine amends suffering and it tempers the processes of mortality, at the same time it works at the structural level and as an institutional tool to unify a diverse citizenry by controlling randomness at the level of human biological variation. The business of modern medicine is to sort, then, human variations into the opposing categories of disease and non-disease, or what has been considered since the 19th century to be normal. Making up new disease categories, or what medical science calls discovering new diseases, is a growth industry, as are all industries in our market-driven economy. Health is the absence of traits identified as disease, and normal is the statistical calculation of health. The practices of technology, of eugenic science, aimed to control human biology, our very enfleshment, by continually shaping and reshaping our future selves and our future communities to be ever healthier, always replacing the present with a better future. The engine that mobilizes this aspiration to control the future through action in the present is, of course, our modern economic system of capitalist production, and more recently, consumer capitalism, the force that drives forward perpetual change, continually remaking our collective today into a better tomorrow. Now, what's wrong with this modern medical scientific impulse to make us better? A good question. According to the philosopher Jürgen Habermas, it creates, and I'm quoting Habermas here, a liberal eugenics regulated by supply and demand. This liberal eugenics then turns people into products. It increases social inequality, and it fosters a commercial medical industrial complex. Taken together, these technologies and practices carry out what I have called a velvet eugenics. Imagined as beneficial and nonviolent, velvet eugenics aims to standardize human variation in the interest of individual market-driven liberty at the expense of social justice and the robust diversity and inclusion upon which modern egalitarian social orders depend. Velvet eugenics, then, calls us to a collective caution that recognizes the limits of the human capacity to control the future through actions in the present, no matter how well intended, carefully conceived, morally considered, or rigorously monitored it may promise to be. To return to my friend's story that I began with, the burden of knowledge that my friend carries is his terrible recognition that the logic of velvet eugenics would have deprived him of his beloved son. What haunts him is that wisely deliberated, well-informed decision that he would have made about whether his son would exist in the world, he now understands as the worst choice he could ever have made. Three, to contemplate here with you today, in conclusion, an alternative future, I'm going to offer the late wisdom of two famous scientists, a paleontologist, Stephen Jay Gould, and a neurologist, Oliver Sacks. As each of these scientists was dying of cancer, after a lifetime of observing their fellow humans, each one of them called for humility, but in different ways. Gould reflected on his cancer diagnosis by explaining the statistical calculations that doctors use to predict life expectancy for cancer patients. And in doing so, he clarified how individual variations cannot really be accounted for in the narrative of the future that medical science calls prognosis. Gould's statistical analysis leads him to conclude, and I quote, "Variation itself is nature's only irreducible essence." Gould's pronouncement suggests, then, that standardizing human variation through medical interventions intended to improve, to normalize, to make healthy future persons might not only be imprudent, but it may be a form of hubris, that Promethean overreaching that the political theorist Michael Sandel finds in the aspiration to enhance future humans through medical technologies. Oliver Sacks, who gave us late wisdom, like Gould's statistical insight, had its beginnings in clinical observations of patients with rare and interesting neurological disorders. And I think many of us will know Sacks's work. Moving between medical description and literary chronicle in his accounts of his patients, Sacks captured the distinctiveness of these unusual ways of being in the world. He shifted from reporting on clinical cases to collecting ethnographies of the exotic people to whom he was persistently drawn. such as, of course, the very famous, and I'm quoting, man who mistook his wife for a hat. Toward the end of his life, and especially after his cancer diagnosis, Oliver Sacks became his own case study, finally a patient akin to the ones he had been observing. Anticipating his own imminent death, Sacks concluded in his posthumously published book, Gratitude, that, and I'm quoting, "When people die, they cannot be replaced. They leave holes that cannot be filled, for it is the fate, the genetic and the neural fate of every human being to be a unique individual, to find his own path, to live his own life, and to die his own death." Gould and Sacks both recognize the moral value of individual biological variations to our shared social and evolutionary destiny. Here is their philosophical and scientific conclusion. Genotype diversity, that is, variation among species, is the essence of life, and phenotype diversity, which is our distinctive human individuality, is what gives life meaning. This wisdom of these philosopher-scientists counsels us that the intricate intertwining of sameness and difference that links human generations in an ever-emerging biological system, we should not endeavor to control. Rather, we should maintain a respectful stewardship toward human biodiversity. This is the scientific and the humanistic truth, of course, that underpins my friend's conviction that parenting a unique individual embedded in the network of human relationships has given meaning to his own life. How might then such a claim from these contemporary wise men, if you will, square with the troubled history of human gathering ourselves into tribes of imagined sameness and turning upon those who we imagine as different from us? Why have we organized ourselves in communities ever suspicious of human variation, ever ready to recognize one another as foreigners and to attack one another on that account? This paradox between our requirement for and simultaneous intoleration of human variation is perhaps the fundamental prompt for the knowledge-making enterprise that we think of as the humanities. In other words, this is what the humanities does. Such questions underlie not only how we have organized ourselves into communities across time and place, but it's also offered us the occasion to contemplate our differences, most recently through the continuities and the contradictions of what historians have called the late modern era. In light of what Gould and Sacks observe about the value of distinctive human lives, both scientific and social, we can conclude that eugenic science, whether supported by totalitarian or liberal regimes, runs counter to the best interests of human communities and human individuals. The wisdom of Gould and Sacks suggests that we should distinguish between eugenic technology and humane technology. And you'll note in this concluding section that I'm using a lot of shoulds intentionally, because I want to create a moral sense in my explanations here of my friend and his story. Eugenic technology then aims to control contingency by medically producing future persons and communities according to the value of ascendant groups at particular times and places in human history. Such technologies assume a stable and attractable relationship between action and outcome that depends on denying historical evidence and philosophical cautions about the existential situation of human emplacement and enfleshment in world and time. The moral wrong, then, of eugenic technologies is that they assure that the existence of all future persons is conditional. In contrast, humane technologies, which I'm going to talk more about in conclusion here, honor and accommodate the widest range of human variation. That means that they insist that we design and build a world shaped to fit human variation and individual distinctiveness, rather than attempting to shape bodies to fit the existing world. It also means that we must develop an attitude of humility that I've mentioned before toward human biodiversity in imagining another person's life and how any of us live. This requires resisting a notion of technological progress that continually categorizes human diversity in terms of new disease to be identified and eliminated. Such an enterprise then regularizes human minds and bodies according to concepts of advantage, or of a narrow version of health, or a commercially incentivized growth industry of pathological diagnosis, or a notion of individual liberty at the expense of the common good. Humane technologies, in contrast, support the existence of present and future persons in all our human distinctiveness. Humane technologies, then, create an environment in which people grow into themselves. For humans to thrive, we need to be ensconced in an environment that sustains the particular form, function, and needs of our bodies. We should devote technology to the humane goal of providing every human being with a genuinely open future to grow into the distinct and particular individual that they are, rather than making them into something we think they should be. Providing this open future, of course, does not preclude appropriate interventions, sometimes medical, sometimes social, that ameliorate pain and suffering, promote human functioning and flourishing, or provide technologies that bridge flesh and world. We should invest more resources in sustaining human variation than in researching and developing commercial medical technology that reduces that human variation. Resource allocation should develop and support environments and technologies through which human distinctiveness can flourish. Liberty, then, should be understood as the freedom to grow from our distinctive individuality, not according to conceptions of health, normalcy, advantage, or quality of life thresholds imposed by the preferences of others or by medical authority, and too often justified as the best interests of the individual. Humane technologies accommodate rather than eliminate human diversity. What the late wisdom of Oliver Sacks and Stephen Jay Gould tell us is what my friend with the beloved Son knows, and that is that the short span of human life and imagination limits our capacities to anticipate the consequences of present actions to control future outcomes. The promise of eugenic technologies to control future persons blunts our capacity to appreciate the unexpected. The purpose of evolution, the geneticist and Nobel laureate Mario Capecchi told me, is to anticipate the unexpected. To do its work of curing, medical science conceptualizes future persons as composites of traits identified as normal or abnormal, rather than imagining my friend's son as the whole person that his father experiences him as being. From loving his son and from the relationships that this love has secured, my friend has learned that the human variations we think of as disabilities or disease are not separable from the wholeness of our being. What my friend knows about his son is the wisdom of the late, is the wisdom of the poet Lori Lambeth, who tells us, and I'll leave you with this wonderful quote, "All creatures who persist are whole." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosemarie. And we will just end the slides and come up, and we have the remainder of the time for Q&A. So we have 22 minutes. I'd invite all participants to send your questions to the panelists, and then I will filter through those and give questions to Rosemarie. But thank you so much. We're all clapping wildly from our homes. I just want to kick us off with a question. I was very intrigued by the juxtaposition, if you will, of your friend's son and that very compelling story at the outset with quotations and wisdom from Gould and Sachs, both of whom were dying of cancer. And what struck me is that as a physician and an internist, I think of perhaps patients who are dying of diseases, often cancer, as recipients of some of the greatest humane technology that we have. And I just want to make sure that we're or I guess I'm asking you about how much of a distinction do you want to make between persons living with disabilities and those unique needs for advocacy and humane technologies versus persons dying with cancer or other chronic diseases?
Well, that's a really important question, and you've perceived the complexity of the kinds of arguments that I'm putting forward in terms of what is sometimes called the critique of the medical model. And my answer to that would be that what we really want to do is to be very careful about the distinctions between eliminating disease and treating disease. We also want to be very careful about our distribution of resources. The emphasis on achieving health as a form of normalcy at all costs, as opposed to the treating or the amelioration, or even through palliative medicine, the addressing of, to use the philosophical terms, our enfleshed selves, our phenomenological selves, our selves of human finitude. I think we want to think quite carefully about how we distribute those resources and what this rush toward cure and elimination of any kind of anomaly might be and might mean, especially in terms of our efforts and our distribution of resources.
So I have a follow-up question from Catherine Carroll about, well, it's not truly a follow-up to mine, but I'm going to put it together. She asks, would you argue that the medical equipment rationing plans that often put people with certain disabilities in the position of receiving less medical care if rationing is necessary, is this eugenic technology or humane technology? And if it is eugenic technology, how would we ration instead? How should we think about rationing? Should it be random selection?
That's a very good question. And of course, there have been many conversations, some of which I've actually been involved in, which have examined this question of equity in relation to resource distribution, especially, of course, under difficult situations such as this pandemic has presented us with. And the caution I would offer is that when the entire apparatus of medicine is put together, it's difficult to conceptualize, and this is a real challenge in any way, human variations in terms of human equality rather than in a kind of hierarchy of capacity and health. And if we really, as they say, take seriously the idea put forward by something like the human and civil rights movements that all human beings are of equal value, then we need to rethink the idea that based on what we think of as disability, disease, age, that those descriptions of human variation create a kind of hierarchy of value amongst human beings. And it's really a challenge to conceptualize all of us of equal value. But I think this is what bioethics can actually do effectively because of its commitment to equality as a principle of modern liberal social orders. And so in terms of rationing, what that would suggest to us is a really complicated rethinking of what might be the most intuitive thing, and that is the people who get the ventilators or the resources are the ones that have the most health or the most potential for benefiting from them, which is a calculation, of course. As a result of this pandemic, of course, we know that many institutions and states have been rethinking their resource allocation policies. And of course, one of the things that we've discovered is that many institutions and many states, by institutions, I mean healthcare institutions and states, have had just flat out discriminatory policies. For example, a policy that says that people with so-called mental retardation are last in line for getting medical resources, such as ventilators. And so it's been a very positive experience for all of us collectively in healthcare, as well as, as citizens, to try to rethink the residue of, if you will, disability discrimination or this form of inequality, and to reevaluate how things like the Disability Rights Movement and the Americans with Disabilities Act have really changed, and the laws that went with them and the policies that came along have really changed the way we're imagining this. So I think it's important to have a kind of historical perspective on this as well. It's a long answer.
Yeah, I'm sure, especially in this current moment with COVID and trying to think very strategically through how we handle limited resources, there's really no satisfying answer.
And I want to really respect the complexity of all of this. The critique that I bring forward in my work of medical science, of medicine, of health, I want to understand, to be understood as a provocation, as a productive critique, rather than a toxic critique.
Yes, yeah. So we have many more questions, so I'm going to try to get to as many as possible. This from Emily Gordon. Do you think this desire to control the future and maintain freedom of choice, for example, about decisions like having a child with disabilities, is universal across the world? Or rather, is it a contingent outgrowth of the way that the US medical system has developed intertwined with capitalism, say?
It's, again, a complicated question that is larger than consumer capitalism and even larger than, say, the United States. I think the best way to conceptualize this is, and what I was kind of suggesting, in terms of looking at what we call the development of the modern era, or the moment we're in now, which is called late modernity, which is characterized by consumer capitalism or capitalism in general. But more than that, it is characterized, as I tried to explain a little bit, by a concept of the individual that is both beneficial for us as human beings and also can be mobilized in a way that is detrimental to us, kind of like every other idea. So what we have is this concept of the individual having liberty. And the word liberty we're quite familiar with. We think of liberty because we think of the French Revolution and the American Revolution. But it's also the idea of independence, it's the idea of individualism, it's the idea of freedom and the idea of autonomy, which is a particularly important element in the way we practice medical ethics or medicine now. And that is, patient autonomy means that individual patients should have the right to control what happens to them in a medical context. And in a political context, of course, freedom and independence and autonomy are also extremely important. I think what we want to think through carefully is the complexities of how the exercise of liberty often is not compatible with the common good. And to try to navigate a kind of compromised position there that has in front of it at all times what is best for the largest number of people. And I'm not suggesting a kind of utilitarian concept here. A really good of that example of that most people are familiar with, of course, is that the practice of selecting for and against sex in reproductive autonomy is and should be in many ways a really fundamental right. People should have the right or the liberty to choose the family they wish to have. But as many of us are aware, this particular practice is and can cause problems to the common good, which come from, of course, increasing or changing the proportion of boys and girls born into the world, which are creating tremendous social problems in some places. And of course, the social problem that creates, that exercise of personal liberty, which is genuinely and correctly the thing we ought to have, is producing the unintended consequences of violence. Violence put forward by groups that this practice disenfranchises.
So I want to pick up off of there are two different sort of groups of questions that are going on that get to some of what you just said. So I'm going to put out two questions for you. Technology leading to violence, or what the limits might be of humane technology. So we have so much that we can do, and yet it also has the potential to cause so much harm. One person puts out the question about the recent International Commission on the clinical use of human germline genome editing and asks, are we already too late? So that's sort of one area of questions, the limits of human technology, and have we already done too much, or have we already gone too far? And then there's another sort of group of questions, and I'm combining several people's questions to ask more specifically, not just about sex selection of embryos, but is eliminating embryos for other reasons, perhaps including other sorts of diseases, would you draw a line, is that eugenics or isn't it?
Right.
How would you make sense of that? And yeah, so there's sort of two different areas we could go.
Right. And I do want to return to what you were suggesting in relation to Gould and Sachs and cancer. And that is, I want to affirm what you suggested, and that is that the complexity of all this is that technologies don't fall into the absolute categories of one being a humane technology and another being a eugenic technology. Of course, any technology can be used for humane or for eugenic purposes. And that's what makes it difficult. Because I do not make policy, and I often avoid making policy recommendations other than something like saying we ought to devote resources to preserving human variation. I am often myself reluctant to name conditions that we ought to eliminate or support. And I know that that might be kind of a cop-out, but in truth, what I want to try to do is ask questions rather than drive specifics of policy. That said, in terms of gene editing, I think there's a case to be made for considering, especially because it's already being done, what conditions. And if you listen to anyone who talks about CRISPR, for example, or gene editing, they want to name conditions. And I think there's a case to be made for considering what we really think serious disease that might be eliminated, either somatically or in terms of heritable gene editing, what those might be. And my concern is that once we start thinking about specific diseases, we very quickly go capacious. We very quickly move from something that we might all agree with, like Tay-Sachs, for example, to something that is really quite highly contested. Make no mistake that there's lots of money to be made, and there's lots of support for, and we all know this, gene editing processes that might identify and eliminate conditions that we think of as autism. This is one reason that I wanted to use my friend as a kind of narrative case study. So very quickly, techno-optimism moves from things that we might have agreed upon at one time are really anchors of human variations that we really don't want to continue, to a kind of broad swath of conditions that we think we might not want to have ourselves, or that people might not want to live with. And this is why I think it's so important for us to listen to the voices of people with disabilities, to the patient communities, to the bioethicists that represent this really basically more conservative, medically conservative position.
Mm-hmm. So there are a number of people who are wanting to push you for more sort of practical advice and how to actually navigate this in the clinical setting, but you're not a physician, so maybe I will table that. If we have time, we could come back to that. There is a question about just, could you explain more about what you mean by velvet eugenics and how this concept might help us assess emerging reproductive genetic technologies, things like that. Could you say more about velvet eugenics?
Yes, thank you. I took the term, as perhaps many of us recognize, from the political events, the description of the political events that gave us the end of the Berlin Wall and the end of what we call the Cold War. It was always imagined by the West and the East also that in order to reunite the Europe or the world, that World War II had split into the East and the West, that what was necessary, and the Berlin Wall, of course, stands as an emblem, as a metaphor for this, what was necessary was some kind of a violent upheaval. People were getting killed as they were trying to cross the wall. There were armies mounted on either side of the wall, and that whole division of Europe into the East and the West. And suddenly, for many people, a diplomatic or a kind of gradualist solution and reunification took place. And it began to be described after 1990 as a velvet revolution, meaning that what had been imagined as only remedied by a violent revolution was in fact created by something quite different. Whether we analyze it as being the will of the people or a kind of historical exhaustion by the conflict that was that division. And I thought it was a very vivid metaphor. And remember, I'm an English professor, so words matter really a lot. And metaphors of all kinds are very important in helping us understand what it is that we need to understand in order to be human beings and to live our lives. And so what I wanted to suggest was that what we might want to do, instead of going immediately to something so divisive as laws, that we might want to think about re-scripting the cultural narratives, telling different stories, if you will, about what it means to live with a disability, what it means to have a person with a disability in your family, that might be a kind of velvet revolution that could be put up against the velvet eugenics that techno-optimism and what I'm calling eugenic technologies brings forward.
That's great. I think in the interest of time, there are more questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I thank you for your time and for sharing your story, your own experience with us. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. And thanks to everyone for participating.
Very much. And to all of you.
Have a wonderful night.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
You too.